Okay. Well, actually, before I get to the first question from the audience, there's actually from somebody I'm really happy submitted a question. So one of the interesting things is that across all of your work and all your presentations is that it's unsurprising, but it's very reassuring that the minute you start talking about programmable material, what most of you brought up is the people who are doing the programming, which is like the users, right? That it's not just about making some abstract open system. It has users at the end of it, and that there's a certain intention and delight in thinking about who those are. But I guess one of my questions is, when you're designing for those types of systems, do you start with the user? Do you start with the uses, or is it the system? Like, where do you begin in designing a system that has communities and users in it?
I mean, we started selfishly to make something that we needed to use for our own work.
Yeah.
And then made it modular enough that people could expand it for, empowering people to follow their own desires. So I didn't need to be, fabricating objects, but other people did. So in the modular system, they were able to make libraries for fabricating objects that build on top of the initial work we did. So it's really, I think it's important to be a domain expert in the area that you're working in, and nobody is a domain expert in every area. So I think the modularity of the system was what was really key.
And also, I think just in terms of how you share things being important. So you've built something, the next most important thing to do is then send that out to other people who are either going to build upon it, react to it, whatever. I think one of the really terrific things in the last talk was seeing these fab labs all over the place that are kind of taking the ideas and kind of doing different sorts of things with it. And I think that's kind of that multiplying effect is really what will drive this type of effort.
One of the things that was interesting from the beginning, Nicholas said, that the creators will be the inventors, and that relates to the sketchbook idea. And I think across the panel, a lot of the things we saw were how code became a new sketchbook. It became a new tool to sketch and think about whatever it was in a fast way. But the same thing where, Nadya, with your work, machines in some way became like the sketchbook. We could quickly modularize and connect and adapt and have these machine sketchbooks. And then going beyond that, I think the playfulness of the droplets or the materials that I showed, I'm really interested in how materials start to become a creative collaborator, or how the materials become a sketchbook. Mm-hmm. So all of these are, maybe different users, but also have different agency in that creative exploration, whether it's code, machines, or materials.
I think one of the things that I'm really interested in across this question is how tools scale into systems, where it's not just one user at a time, but where the system aggregates users to produce emergent effects that are beyond what the intentionality of any one user. And one way we think about that transformation is as platforms, which are sort of, I guess, going against Lev's original point. They're a way in which sort of a range of variables is made into a particular set of constants that are fixed, like an urban grid, upon which things may grow in a way and learn, and this as well. And I think processing has worked this way and this as well. And so I think some of these questions, around there's also probably something to be said, considering the interdisciplinarity of this group on the polyvalence of the term program. We have obviously the software program of this interdisciplinary, but architecture, of course, is interested in the question of program on the sort of modeling of this as well. Political program, this works as well. And I think part of the way we think about this transition from tool to platform is one that transverses each of these.
In terms of some of our work with Foldscope, the idea of community is central because you can never predict or anticipate what users would do. And so, on one hand, we have community health workers who are using these tools, and on the other hand, you have kids who want to understand what glitter is, and you let them run, and I think all that feedback comes back. And from day one, I mean, as a tool maker, I think it's very clear to people who make tools that it's the users broadly that'll define what that tool will be known for, whether you like it or not.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's just this interesting thing that you can't really imagine. You can't really imagine the user, and yet you have to design for them.
Yeah, and that's why all of these are 4 or 5 years to 10 years of work that goes into coming to where they are. There are all kinds of false starts, and
I think having different feedback systems at different scales as well. So running workshops in small groups and getting that immediate feedback, and then putting as much time and effort into the community and the social components, finding a balance between the technology innovation and development and the social components, but having a kind of a thick channel for being able to understand what's happening is so important.
I think it's one of the major shifts in terms of how people who design and create things think about their work, which is that it used to be that the day that you release it, that you ship it, you're done, right? And you go to sleep, or you get drunk, or you do whatever it is you do to celebrate the fact that something is done. And that the day of releasing something, with basically all the work that you guys have talked about, is just like it's the least important day, right? It's just that's actually where things begin. And I think
That's where the drinking begins.
also.
I think there's something to be said there also for infrastructure and maintenance of platforms like this. Processing now has their foundation, and these are like infrastructures that then come into place sort of arbitrarily. Like, yes, I also was a user who was frustrated about how machines were designed and made, and so I made some kind of platform systems that could scale better because I wanted it. But then going forward, how do you have that be maintainable? How is that going to continue?
Right.
If people don't become members of processing, what's going to happen? We're going to have to move on to something else. Right. And for certain things, I think the way that infrastructure has grown traditionally, like maybe through the internet, the W3C, and places like that, it's just this sort of hippie idea of neoliberalism that, we can all do this. We're self-sufficient people who need infrastructure and applications, and we're going to make both of them. But as Benjamin's talk definitely pointed out, the world becomes a more complicated space, and things are a lot more complex than maybe they were in the early, when Nicholas was still Nicky. I like that. How are those infrastructures still going to be maintained and stay interoperable and also be inclusive and accessible? And that's something that I don't know. I don't think that this panel embodies very well at all. We're all a bunch of people with a bunch of MIT affiliation. This is the premier elite institution, and so maybe the work that we look at looks really democratic and inclusive, but it's also sort of not. And how is that going to scale?
But one thing about materials for me is that in some ways, going back to the physics of computation or going back to materials for me becomes more democratized because we all live and experience and build and can see things and feel things and touch things. And so I'm really interested in how we bring electronics and code back to the physical and allow us to play again and allow us to experiment and physically make, whether that's making machines or playing with materials or pushing on them or activating them in the same sophisticated way that groups could do with code, but it's much more difficult to be able to do that. I mean, it took processing and Ben and Casey a lot of effort and a lot of time to try to bring it to a language that anyone can use, and it's still super challenging to do that. But anyone can pick up Lego and snap these things together. Anyone could learn about logic or sensors or actuators through a material on a desk that's moving. And so there's something inspiring about that, about the democratization of information in materials.
All right.
I was going to say that it's also part of where the pedagogy side of what we were doing at MIT came from, though, too, is that it's not that interesting to have a handful of people at MIT who can build this stuff. It gets a lot more interesting if you actually get it out there and push it out there. And that Part of that also came from, so John Maeda, our advisor, one of the things that his advisors, when he was doing his PhD in design in Japan, would say to him was, well, that's great, you're doing all these complex technical things and you're doing code and design and all that, but who else is doing it? So you don't have any peers, and you don't have anybody else by which you can actually compare this work, and so you need to actually go out there and get other people kind of creating these things so we can even think about them and evaluate them, and it's just not that compelling if, again, the people who are already drawn to it are going to find their way into it, but rather how to, expanding that audience being so important.
I just wanted to say that I think, Skylar, your point about making the tools at the point of accesses to the platform as egalitarian as possible and building them on experiences that are points of access that we have in common or experiences we have in common is extremely important. And I see that in a way as a sort of, at the same time, there's still the question of as tool scales into platform and as software eats the world, more and more of the world, as the platform scales into what is, in essence, a governing apparatus as much as a technical apparatus. It's then the questions, and I'm not saying it goes against your point, but just to echo Nadya's point, it becomes questions of power, questions of interest become inevitable. And while I see those also as design problems, I don't see them necessarily as engineering problems in the conventional way. And so, but none of which to say that precisely why these conversations should be amplified.
So there's first question here is from Carolyn Jones, who says, I liked Casey's phrase, aesthetics of computing. Is there medium specificity in software-generated forms? Is there a trope towards iteration and or symmetry? I think and within that, there are all these larger questions just about the aesthetics that are produced when you build these kinds of systems.
Well, the name comes from John Maeda and his research group at the Media Lab, which started in '97. It was called the Aesthetics and Computation Group. And so that group existed until 2003. I've always been baffled by the name. I've never heard a clear explanation of what it means. I think that there is this sense of an aesthetics of computation, which is clean and uses like platonic solids and basic forms and shapes, and it's very inhuman. I think that a lot of languages and tools make it easy to make things like that. But I mean, one thing I've learned through teaching over the years is that there are so many other ways of doing things. Because the students that I'm teaching, they're not interested in computation. They're interested in sort of using computation for furthering their own vision and their own work. So they're photographers, they're animators, they want to make games, they're bookmakers. And so they make things that are radically different from anything I've ever made. And I think they've really proven to me that there is no aesthetics of computation. But the tools are biased and weighted to, I think, and so a lot of the first things people make, undergraduate work, workshop work, it does seem to have a certain aesthetic. But I really have been working hard to promote projects that are of a different style, come from a different framework, a different ways of thinking.
And I've noticed that, whether that's code or a milling machine or a laser cutter or a 3D printer, it's almost the same as like giving a kid a crayon or eventually a pencil or watercolors or clay or whatever it is. In the beginning, they will likely make the things that you would normally make with the pen or the pencil or the watercolor, and they'll make a mess, and then it'll, and then they'll refine it. But over time, I think two things happen. One is that you upgrade your tools, and you then look for new tools or make your tool, which is really interesting. And then the second is that the project becomes more important than the tool. And I think that's where you're getting at it. And the aesthetic stops looking like the bias of the tool and starts to look like the authorship and the interest and the curiosity and the weirdness of what you want to do. And that's really where we want to get to, that it's not about the tool anymore. In the beginning, we're excited about that, but eventually it's like the concept is more important.
Yeah. And I think this is a very important point, which starts to piggyback on what Nadya had said about where is the democratization right here. People do these things not just for fun, but because there is also a deep need. And most of the time, I mean, when you talk about projects that have a kind of a healthcare context or even an environmental context, a biodiversity context, it starts to happen where very clearly once they've explored the territory, the project takes over and they build a community around that. And they own that question. I mean, so many times the goal of at least the types of tools we think about is to make them as open-ended as possible, like a window, but then what you look through it to see is really defined by the community. And that is almost essentially the ideal way to do this would be is to really pass the ownership. The ownership really belongs to the community. And in that, somewhere there is a democratization. And I think if you don't realize this fast enough on the project side, is that this is only tools are only conduit to the bigger
It's
thing.
incredibly hard, though.
Of course, it's hard. That's why we do it, right?
Well, I mean, just the
not well-
maintaining open and participatory access in a system that has to Mako
As
Hill.
complex as a city, for example.
Yeah, no, it's hard. Yeah, I'm not saying that's the answer, but I'm saying that's why we do this, because
Well, it's an interesting
is a-
research question, maybe. Like, how can you maintain a system that stays open and is consensus-based, or at least somehow furthers best practices without reenacting we made up this system, so
Or has
like,
those
it's great
effects-
if you want to port it to JavaScript, but
Or
make
has-
sure.
Or it has those effects.
Yeah.
It has those effects. There may be an asymmetry of means and ends that's worth considering.
Actually, can I just say one more thing about that former question. I think that there's moments when formal material exploration is a good thing. And I'm thinking back to, like, since we talked a little bit about the Bauhaus earlier today, like when Moholy-Nagy went to the Bauhaus and kind of took it from a craft-based education into working with industrial materials, working with metals, and then later with plastics. I think that that was a necessary kind of experimentation. I think the idea of the aesthetics of computation was that there was a period in the 90s where we needed to explore the medium, and we just needed to see what it could do and what it was capable of. For me personally, I went through that period, but now I'm of the feeling that work needs to be more based in a strong social point of view or a strong political point of view. And that really, I think that one maybe evolves into the other, or it just takes a little bit of time to grow into the other.
Evidently, we only have like another minute or so. So, and there's a lot of questions, but instead, I'm gonna ask one, which I was thinking about as I was listening to you all, which is so. As computation basically starts to very deliberately shape the physical world around us, in all of your work and investigations, I mean, would you characterize it more as are we discovering something about physical material and behavior, et cetera, that we're lifting up, or are we imposing a computational model of the world down into matter, or both, or neither? Right? In other words, are we taking a worldview and trying to push it into material? Are we trying to understand something about? And when I say material, I mean also life, because that was referred to in many of these presentations. Are we lifting up a worldview? Are we imposing a worldview? What's happening? Like, what is happening as these?
There's an assumption there that there's like somehow the world and us, and that we do not constitute the world. And that what we're making, and as we're making, isn't also being, and vice versa. And so I think the question presupposes the answer, where you say, I'm creating a system in which this certain kind of framework can be used, but the assumption there is that the system also doesn't affect you and vice versa. So I object.
So noted.
I agree with your point, with Nadya's point about the being in the world. Part of the argument I was trying to make. At the same time, there is always epistemology built into the tools and the procedures by which we would use and project these in a certain way. So my answer would definitely be both. I think part of this, that we've discovered computation as much as we've invented it in this regard works there as well. But I also see it as it may be a path towards what the paradigm that comes next. The next machine after computation may be something that we get to closer to this. It may have more to do with what Nicholas was talking about, biotech as the new digital, as opposed to the other way around, which is where we're at now.
I sort of see it as both, right? Like,
Yeah.
on one hand, we in order to solve more complex, difficult problems, we tend to throw more money in machines and more complexity, so you get more with more. And I think over time you start to question that and think, maybe we could do more with less, and we could start to take out the devices, take out the computer, take out the actuator, and you're only left with material that has all the agency of all the complex robot computers we had before, and now it's this simple, dumb thing that has all these awesome features. So that's kind of trying to simplify over time. And the other one is that we're discovering new things, and whether that's synthetic biology or material science or Manu's amazing work, we're discovering amazing new things with a new kind of lens of elegance looking at it. And I think those two are coming together in order to create this new perspective on matter.
I mean, I think just to add to this, one important aspect while doing all this work is to realize that our viewpoint of computation has been based on the history of, so physics of computation in general, or if you were to the best computer that's out there right now with our brain, what do we actually know about its modes and models? And yes, we have theories and ideas and fantastic ideas, but can somebody singularly say? And so, you just have to be open to discovering. And ironically, we have also had sort of a fascination with far more complex biological problems where we forgot a little bit to the fact that a single cell is a remarkable machine. Yeah. And that now is coming up. And so I think there's so much to learn that it would be so silly to take our models and impose it. Although if you don't do that, right, you're not making progress. So yeah, I think you have to keep an open mind.
All right. Well, let me thank all of you for not just for your presentations, but for your amazing work. Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody.